Southeast Asia has a fuel problem. When shipments through the Strait of Hormuz were disrupted in February 2026, fuel prices jumped. And when fuel prices jump, so do transport costs, electricity bills, food prices, and the cost of daily life. So the problem is actually a lot bigger than just fuel. Unlike Asia's advanced economies like China, Japan, or South Korea, Southeast Asia's emerging economies didn't have the stockpiles, fiscal space, and financial strength when the Hormuz disruption hit. As a result, the economic impacts have been much faster and more painful.
If you take the 11 countries of Southeast Asia, this is a region of the world that has between 650 and 700 million people. It's one of the youngest and most dynamic and rapidly growing regions of the world. But that region and its economic growth is very much fueled by energy. Most of these countries, not all, but most of these countries are heavily dependent on outside sources of energy, much of it coming from the Gulf, much of it via the Strait of Hormuz. So that's why I think the Iran-related energy shocks coming out of the conflict in the Middle East have been just so existential for many of the countries in the region.
The pressure looks a little different in each country. As a net energy importer, Indonesia is very exposed to this crisis. Jakarta is holding down fuel prices with subsidies and price caps, but that means more strain on the state budget. And this amplifies domestic concerns about fiscal sustainability and investor confidence. Vietnam has taken steps to mitigate short-term risks, from fast-tracking the establishment of a strategic oil reserve to cutting fuel tariffs and diversifying crude supplies. But it has limited room to absorb an extended disruption. Rising inflation will undermine investments in energy-intensive sectors like data centers, chips, AI, and advanced manufacturing, the very sectors Vietnam has been aggressively building for the last few years. Thailand entered the crisis with low domestic demand and modest growth compared to its neighbors. While the crisis hasn't led to political instability, it could amplify public dissatisfaction amid weak growth, high household debt, and rising consumer prices. The Philippines, which imported more than 95% of its crude oil from the Middle East before the crisis, also faces disruptions to the remittances usually sent home from a large population of Gulf-based migrant workers, a crucial source of income for Manila's consumption-driven economy. In March, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos declared a national energy emergency as fuel prices surged across transportation, food, and utilities. Malaysia fared better. As a net energy exporter, it is relatively insulated compared to its neighbors. However, its refining and downstream petrochemical sectors still pay the price when natural gas and crude prices rise. Malaysia faces unsustainable fuel subsidy bills, even as Petronas, the national oil company, benefits from elevated export revenues. Right now, most governments in the region are trying to cushion the hit.
Growth projections will be threatened, I think, by this energy crunch, number one. Number two, fiscally, many countries in the region actually subsidize, or at least several of them do subsidize their energy prices. So obviously they're going to come under increasing fiscal pressure. The governments will, whether they can actually sustain those subsidies amidst these price hikes.
You can also see the impact of these disruptions across sectors in Southeast Asia, including manufacturing, metals, tech, and tourism. In tech, Malaysia's rapidly growing data center industry is being squeezed by higher power and cooling costs, threatening its appeal to foreign investors. In Vietnam, rising costs complicate Hanoi's plans to expand into energy-intensive sectors like data centers, chips, AI, and advanced manufacturing. More expensive inputs and energy also threaten the Philippines' business process outsourcing sector and Thailand's electronics and hard drive assembly industries. Tourism is also taking a hit. When jet fuel gets more expensive, flights cost more. And when flights cost more, fewer people travel. Bali saw a steep drop in travel from the Gulf and Europe, and Thailand faces disruption to key Gulf aviation transit corridors. In general, Indonesia is hit the hardest, as air travel is often the only practical option to move across the archipelago. The biggest political risk here is the cost of living. Governments across Southeast Asia can buy time by protecting households with subsidies and price caps, but it's not sustainable.
If cost of living across the board is negatively impacted by this crisis, that's going to lead to public discontent, and that can have an impact whether it's on the street or at the ballot box.
The crisis is forcing Southeast Asia to think harder about energy security, where fuel comes from, how power is generated, and how to make the system less vulnerable in the future. Even as Washington and Tehran take steps to end hostilities, the risk environment is unlikely to snap back to what it was before the crisis.
I think the impacts of this crisis will be multifaceted. You will see a real impulse to diversify sources of energy for most of the economies in the region. And that can mean a turn towards renewables. Ironically, in some markets, we've seen a turn back to coal. You'll also see a push to diversify energy sources geographically to be less dependent on Middle Eastern and especially Strait of Hormuz energy sources. So that will be one. But secondly, I think you'll see larger foreign policy impacts as well. I do think that the current crisis is further advancing a sense of concern about the reliability of Washington.
The region has absorbed a significant shock, but the pain still remains. If the disruption drags on into late 2026, the challenge shifts from managing the crisis to surviving a longer stretch of high inflation and weak growth, where governments face harder choices between controlling prices, protecting people, and pleasing investors. This video is part of the No Safe Harbor series by the Asia Group, a report on the consequences of the volatility at the Strait of Hormuz for economies in Asia. You can watch the rest of the videos here and read the report at straitofhormuz.theasiagroup.com. Thanks for watching.